evening to you. Afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. And I'm extremely pleased to be introducing Regina Grafe to you. Regina studied economics and economic history. She completed her PhD in economic history at the LSE. And then went, in fact, on to lecture there, and then moved on to Madrid, Oxford, Northwestern University, and then most recently the European University Institute in Florence, where she was professor of early modern history. And now she moved to Cambridge. We were so thrilled to have her as a new member of staff, and indeed as our chair in economic history. She succeeded Gareth Austin. And Regina's work focuses on the history of capitalism and on the history of the Iberian Empires and of Iberia itself. And she's in fact just co-edited a book that is a fundamental stepping stone in new work on the economic history of the Iberian Peninsula. And I recommend it to you, just out with Cambridge University Press. And her other books include, in 2012, a Princeton University Press book that's a prize-winning book about markets and the backwardness of Spain in the early modern period. And she's currently working on two projects. The first project we're going to hear about this afternoon, and it is about the history of capitalism in that global period. And the second one is a fascinating new project as well on credit giving and colonial economies, which she hopefully can take up after this is completed. But for now, we're going to hear for about 30 minutes a talk by Regina Grafe on this current book project. And then we're very excited to hear or see your questions in the Q&A section, and we'll have 30 minutes time to go through those. So over to you, Regina, and thank you to all already for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, Ulinka. Thank you for this very kind introduction, and thank you for everybody else for joining. As Ulinka said, I only just joined Cambridge, and so in many ways, you are more familiar with Cambridge than I am right now. But what I want to do today is to talk about research. And the research I want to talk about is under the title of the first phase of globalization, 1450 to 1820, roughly, when cooperation beat competition in the imperial Atlantic. Now, undoubtedly, that topic is as large as it is controversial. Globalization, or the rage in the 1990s and early 2000s, has had a decidedly bad press in the wake of the financial and fiscal crises of between 2008 and 2013. As central banks and governments rushed to bring economies back from the brink, the merits of increased global connectedness and integration was called into question by policymakers and the public across the globe. The ruptures that percolated through global supply chains during the COVID years only reinforced that shift. Globalization and its identical twin, internationally integrated market, ceased to be associated with the promise of prosperity for all that economic growth was meant to produce. Instead, growth itself has come to be seen as a harbinger of increased inequality, both within societies and across the globe. Given that the historian's profession deals with the past, we are rarely accused of being ahead of our times. However, I'd argue that economic historians had already begun to rewrite popular narratives of globalization at least a decade before the Icarus called Lehman crashed to Earth. This is particularly true for the period I want to focus on today, often called the first phase of globalization. The term captures a process of increasing global economic interactions, which begin with Iberian maritime trade on the western coasts of Africa in the second half of the 15th century and progressed almost uninterruptedly to the turn of the 19th century, by which time few world regions were outside the dense web of economic ties. But at the same time, global historians have since the 1990s decisively cut to size narratives of the rise of the West. Debates about the Great Divergence and our much improved understanding of European encounters with polities and societies in Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Oceania have shown that European traders, armies, missionaries, and administrators were more often than not outcompeted by local and regional actors. The establishment of political, commercial, and cultural hegemony took a very long time and remained tentative in many places. In others, it failed altogether. And yet, the intensification of exchanges and connections between world regions, rather than within that, was since the late 15th century overwhelmingly driven by European-initiated commercial and colonial expansion. By 1800, European hegemony over the Americas, South Asia, parts of Southeast Asia, and coastal Africa was already a reality. European-induced long-distance entanglements altered and often destroyed previous patterns of regional integration across the globe. Modern trade theory tells us that those who control markets first have a lasting advantage. The skewed power relations of colonial hegemony just reinforce that. Today's global inequalities have their roots in the early modern period. The difficult task we have is thus to recognize that European traders and colonizers often had to collaborate with new processes of social, political, economic integration initiated by what they thought about as native populations across the globe. And at the same time, we must also acknowledge that Europeans maintained control over intercontinental trade and created a set of hegemonic power relations and extractive economic structures whose legacies we still suffer today. In that context, I wonder if any of the extant narratives of the rise of European hegemony convince. Somewhat schematically, one could identify at least 7 lines of argument, which mostly come from the historical subdisciplines. Some historians have argued that political institutions in Europe supported economic activity particularly well. Others believe that European commercial institutions gave them a leg up in global commerce. Comparativists have explored the diversity and location of resource endowments such as coal across the globe for clues of European advantages, or have rooted colonial expansion in European science and technology. More problematic is a resurgence of explanations that see the origins of European hegemony in religious, cultural, and social norms. Did Europeans simply have a comparative advantage at exerting violence? Last but not least is a large-scale intellectual history that seeks to trace the impetus and justification for European expansion in ideologies of universal monarchy, Christianity, and/or the rise of commercial society. Admittedly, this list is anything but exhaustive. And all of these contributions have significantly enriched our understanding of early modern globalization, but strikingly all have one feature in common. I would argue that none manages to step out of the notion that there was some decisive advantage Europeans had that led to superiority, superior science, military, institutions, you name it. They argued directly, or at least imply, that European societies moved faster than non-Europeans to implement more efficient and effective commercial techniques, naval technology, or guns, for that matter. On closer inspection, all of these narratives are underpinned by the very same meta-narrative. In Europe, and by implicit assumption, not elsewhere, there was a pseudo-Darwinian process at work driven by competition between European polities, a process of selection of the fittest for of the most effective and efficient solution in multiple spheres, which was then unleashed onto the rest of the world. Competition within was the driving force of expansion without. That is particularly clear in the Atlantic, where histories of trade, plunder, and smuggling have been woven into a story of the Atlantic as a zone of predation, to use Jan de Vries's phrase. Findlay and O'Rourke argued that, I quote, the period from the middle of the 17th to the early 19th century saw a prolonged struggle among the leading European powers to control the resources, territory, and trade of the New World, end of quote. No peace beyond the line is the often mentioned reference to European peace treaties having no validity in the imperial Caribbean. The meta-narrative of intra-European competitive selection as the origin of outward projection has its own complex history that I will actually not discuss today. Yet it has hardly ever been questioned because it dovetailed so beautifully with national historiographies, which enshrine national competition as a fundamental driver of both intra-European fortunes and extra-European expansion and its spoils. Needless to say that these historiographies cared little that the Eurocentric narratives fundamentally denied any agency to non-European populations. In the alleged race for the domination of the Americas, the Iberians had been involved in colonizing efforts for a century by the time the Anglophone North Atlantic began to take shape in the 1600s. Yet the standard story of economic historians would argue that it was the English Atlantic that became quickly more dynamic and ultimately more beneficial for its European metropolis. In a rare moment of agreement, neoliberal economists and critical historians would argue that relatively light regulation of the English or British North Atlantic trade under the navigation laws allowed the maritime economy to support the development of the towns and hinterlands of the west of England and the eastern shores of North America. Famous economists and political scientists in the neo-institutional tradition, from Douglas North to Admiral Johnson Robinson, locate in the settler colonialism of North America what they call the rise of the Western world or the rise of Europe. Critical economic historians, most recently Pitt Hudson and Maxime Berg, remind their readers that since the 1640s, the massive Anglo-Caribbean slavery complex produced an outsized share of those economic benefits. But all would agree with Leonard Costa, Palmer and Reich that Atlantic colonies made the British Isles and its inhabitants, even the poor sort, better off. The story that historians tell about the Spanish Empire could not be more different. Eminent historians of Spanish America, Stanley and Barbara Stein, were blunt. Here's a quote. At the end of the 17th century, after 200 years of imperialism and nominal control of the human and natural resources of dominions in America and the Western Pacific, Spain was an underdeveloped, stagnant area of Western Europe. End of quote. Again, the assessment of economists and political scientists on the one hand, and of historians on the other, have been broadly consistent. Social scientists have argued that extractive institutions focused overwhelmingly on the silver mining sector not only exploited indigenous populations, but also held back development of the colonial economy as a whole. Historians have recovered the metaphors contemporaries used to describe silver from the Americas leaving Spain as fast as the rain runs off the roof. In the 20th century, the Mexican novelist Carlos Fuentes picked up an old theme when he referred to his country's history as that of a beggar sitting on a mountain of gold. In the imperial Atlantic, Spain lost out to its competitor Britain, its potential riches squandered. The way it organized its trade in the so-called Carrera de Indias imposed a hopeless monopoly system that discouraged commercial development, we are told. Silver flowed out, while the Pacific, in direct trade to Asia, and via the Atlantic to be transshipped from Spain to Northern Europe, and hence by Northern European traders to Asia. Nothing came back in return. Most recent research in economic history, however, paints a very different picture. Expansion of trade and investment in the Atlantic was in fact hemispheric, often integrating the North and South Atlantic. It was also pan-European. Almost all of Western and even Central Europe was directly or indirectly involved. And rather than cutthroat competition between empires, recent studies of English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Danish, and Dutch imperial spaces in the Americas show plenty of complementarity and cooperation. Boundaries which once were imagined as fixed turned out to be malleable and often easy to cross. In the time that remains, I want to take up those news stories and outline for you arguments why we should leave behind the notion that competition was a fundamental driving force of European expansion without. I want to convince you that the idea of competition and selection fundamentally misrepresents how European actors engaged with each other, the resources they drew on in global exchanges, and the limitations they faced. I also want to convince you that cooperation was just as important in creating European hegemony as competition. I'll break down this very large argument by first telling you a few things about the Spanish Atlantic trade that may not be so obvious. And I will then go on to develop two stories from the Imperial Atlantic, comparing its English and Spanish sides. Both stories are linked, but stress somewhat different aspects of my argument. The first is about the genesis of the transatlantic slave trade. The second about commercial regulation outside the slave trade, again in the British and Spanish empires. Not surprisingly, both of the cases I'll tell you about have been told as stories of winners and losers in inter-imperial competition. But as we will see, there's plenty of evidence for the dynamism of trade across these allegedly separate imperial zones. For now, let's start with the Spanish Atlantic. Figure 1, after all, I'm an economic historian, plots the movement of ships between southern Spain and the Spanish colonies over 3 centuries. The early expansion of trade is visible, followed by a point of inflection and significantly lower levels in the second half of the 17th century and the first half of the 18th, and finally there's a rapid rise. The curve reflects several processes at the same time. The dramatic increase in the early 17th century was partially driven by the dependence of Euro-descendant populations on imports from Europe, but also by the increase in silver production after the 1550s, seen in figure 2. As the Spanish-American economy became more self-sufficient in the early 17th century and the first silver boom ran out of steam, more of the produced silver remained within Spanish America and trade with Spain shrank. But here begins my first story. New research allows us to rethink the established narrative of an extractive economy that exported silver and received nothing in return. I'd suggest that figure 3, based on recent compilations of the transatlantic slave trade database, ought to make us rethink what happened. To understand why, let's remember that the single largest challenge to Spanish hegemony in the Americas was the sudden demographic collapse of the indigenous population. This demographic catastrophe was a consequence of imported diseases and of the violent cultural dislocation and the destruction of the pre-existing pre-Hispanic polities. What the Spanish colonies needed was population. Figure 3 tells us where it came from. Correlation is not causation. The fact that the intensity of commercial exchanges between Spanish America and Spain, tracked in figure 1, bears an uncanny resemblance with the arrival of enslaved people coming to Spanish America, shown in figure 3, should not be interpreted as a simplistic silver for enslaved exchange. Nevertheless, it serves as an important reminder that the single most important import into Spanish America throughout the colonial period were enslaved African people. Over the entire duration of the transatlantic slave trade, 2/3 of those violently deported from Africa to the Americas arrived in Spanish America and Brazil. By the time the plantation complex took off in English-controlled Barbados in the 1640s, 500,000 enslaved people had already been shipped to Spanish America. The creation of the transatlantic slave trade, as we know it in the Spanish colonies, was a human tragedy of monstrous dimensions. It was also a huge commercial success. The purchase of enslaved people was the destination of a large share of the capital investment by Spanish American merchants, hacendados, urban households, and rich monasteries. Sometimes enslaved people bought other enslaved people to finance their own freedom. The work of the enslaved represented an outside transfer in human capital from Africa to Spanish America, both in the modern economic sense of their skills and labor, as well as in the contemporary financial sense as commodified men, women, and children. Their owners invested in them so that they could be made to work, rented out, or forced to turn a share of their independently earned wages over to their owner. They also served as a store of movable capital that could be used as a lien to obtain credit. To understand the significance of this trade, let's take the example of one of the two viceregal capitals of Spanish America, the City of Kings, as Lima was known. Lima could quite literally not have survived without the enslaved. Of the population baptized in Lima's cathedral in the 1540s, almost 60% were indigenous, or what was known as mestizos, people of mixed Euro-descendant and indigenous descent. 30% were Euro-descendants, and just about 10% were Afro-descendants in the 1540s. By 1614, a census suggested that only 11% were either indigenous or mestizo, a fall of more than 80% of their share in the total population. The free and enslaved Afro-descendant population now represented more than 40% of an, of course, much larger total population. Euro-descendants accounted for a little more. In its colonial commercial heyday, 4 out of 10 inhabitants of Lima were Black. The economic circuits that transformed the products of the Spanish colonies, silver, dyestuffs, and others, into the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade are complex and not well understood. But we do know why Spanish Americans could buy enslaved in the 16th or 17th century or 18th century, even though Spanish merchants were rarely directly involved in the forced extraction of the enslaved from the African shores. The answer is cooperation. In order to encourage the shipment of thousands of enslaved Africans to Spanish America, the Spanish monarchy offered contracts that were very similar to those they gave to private investors who supplied the armies or navies or who collected taxes. These so-called Asientos negros evolved over time. In the first 200 years of their existence, the monarchy contracted the transportation of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans to its American colonies. This entirely private business was developed with the participation of merchants from all over Europe. In the early phase, there were Flemish, Genoese investors, Castilians, Upper Germans, and Portuguese. Later, they were joined by the Dutch and the French, and finally, in 1713, by the British. The British Asiento, agreed after the War of Spanish Succession, may well be the one treaty many of you have heard about. It is a beautiful example of how the obsession with supposed intra-European competition has skewed historical knowledge. If you were to read British historiography or even contemporary pamphlets, you would be forgiven for thinking that the British Asiento was an exceptional contract extracted under duress from a weakened Spanish monarchy that gave British merchants unprecedented access to the Spanish colonies, where they had the exclusive right to sell enslaved, as well as a certain number of manufactures. In the event, the only meaningful new right to the British, in comparison to the previous holders of the Asiento, who had been French, was that its representatives in Spanish America could be recruited amongst Protestants as well as Catholics. In everything else, the treaty closely resembled its immediate predecessor. It took the form of the contract that had evolved over the last 24 Asientos, which had been held, as mentioned before, by merchants and companies from all over Europe. As is well known, this particular contract was in fact not very successful and unraveled for good after 1739. That did not stop the Spanish monarchy from offering similar contracts to others afterwards. The so-called Asientos were arguably the contracts that created the transatlantic slave trade. By the mid-17th century, they were responsible for the deportation of 500,000 people. Their origin was in legal forms that had been developed by the Iberian monarchies to contract all manner of services with willing private investors. But their development over time drew on the cooperation with and commercial expertise of every important European merchant community. Spain could count on the collaboration of mercantile interests from across the continent to ship enslaved to its colonies. In the process, the legal forms used became a sort of assemblage of European commercial practice. That contemporary British observers should celebrate the 1713 treaty and claim they had inflicted an exceptional defeat on the Spanish is ironic. The British Asiento was just another instance of a long-standing collaboration of mercantile interests across the continent to supply enslaved people to Spanish-American slave owners. The losers and victims of this nefarious cooperation between multiple European polities were, of course, the enslaved and their families, their lives upended across the horrors of the Middle Passage, to be followed by an unwelcome existence in a continent none of them had chosen. The slave trade was so important for European colonial expansion in the Atlantic that it relied on its own set of rules. And, as I've shown, corporations. My second case looks instead at how these two Atlantic empires, Britain and Spain, regulated all other trades. I will try to explain that complex story even more concisely. My aim is to show you that the story of radically different forms of Atlantic regulation competition between them does not stand up to careful analysis of the rules in place. I've already mentioned the Spanish Carrera Indias and the English navigation laws, which determined who could ship what in which vessels, from where to where, at which rate of duty, and for much of the early modern period. Much has been written about the interplay between changes in how commerce was perceived in the early modern period. For both empires, particular stipulations have been scrutinized in detail. Overall, historians have argued that England's or Britain's commercial regulation had been the handmaiden of colonial success, while Spain's had failed to let it benefit from empire, as we saw above. In the British case, the first navigation acts of the mid-17th century, initiated by the Commonwealth and reissued by the Restoration, were undoubtedly instruments with military and commercial competition in mind. The target were the Dutch. The acts sought to make it impossible for merchants in England and its empire to use often cheaper Dutch shipping and often better commercial services in Dutch towns. The so-called Staple Act later reinforcements of the regulations in turn tied colonial production and consumption to Britain. Spanish regulation created commercial bodies for the purpose of American trade. The so-called Casa de Contratación, the House of Trade, and the Consulado de Indias, the guild-like body that represented the merchants. Historians have been scathing. Antonio Miguel Bernal called the system, I quote, a monopoly organization under the control of a mercantile lobby in connivance with the state. End of quote. The Carrera merchants formed, according to Oliva Melgar, another specialist, I quote, a private corporation that ended up being the body that in practice had acquired the control of the trade and the Carrera, and with it the management and its benefits. End of quote. The Carrera became an example for what modern social scientists would call regulatory capture. For an economic historian, the sets of rules and regulations put together amount to what we would call today regulatory frameworks. They would determine how merchants raised capital, whether traders were free to participate, irrespective of their status as a burgher or a citizen, if all ports were freely accessible, how commercial disputes were settled, who paid taxes and for what, and how much of the trade was in fact regulated by groups of merchants themselves. Interestingly, the contrasting assessment about the sets of laws and rules that were applied in English and Spanish Atlantic trade have been so much set in stone that historians have not even looked at them in a very long time. To the best of my knowledge, the only attempt to discuss the Navigation Acts in their entirety is Lawrence Harper's book of 1939. And the career of the Indias fared no better. The only scholarly work on that regulatory framework is, believe it or not, Clarence Herring's book, which was published in 1918. Generations of historians evidently thought that little could be gained by looking into the box in the archive that was labeled Atlantic Trade Regulatory Frameworks. I, on the other hand, think that box contains fascinating information about how European commercial expansion in the Atlantic worked. There's a small group of scholars who have begun to peel back the layers of paint that hide the contours of Atlantic trade regulation. Javi Lamicus and I have shown elsewhere that the Spanish commercial system in the Atlantic was never a monopoly in the economic sense. I'll spare you the details, but for example, being a member of the Consulado was often an astute move to become a respected merchant, but it was legally not necessary. While many historians have equated the Carrera de Indias with English regulated or chartered companies, such as the Levant Company, with their commercial monopolies, that comparison was clearly wrong. But if not a monopoly organization, what was it? I'd suggest that one particular element of the regulation makes clear what the Carrera was. It also makes clear why it was much more similar to the navigation laws than we have hitherto realized. When the first colonial regulations were created, merchants, monarchs, councillors, and parliaments drew on what they knew. And what they knew were urban regulations, which had existed since the Middle Ages across all of Europe to regulate commerce. One of the most important of these rules was what was known as staple rights in English, coming from the German Stapelrechte or Umschlagsrechte, and across Europe often used in the Latin version jus empori. This was the right, usually of an urban corporation, to ask merchants to bring particular products to the urban center in question, often accompanied by rules stipulated that goods had to be unloaded, that their quality was checked, that they had to be taxed, and sometimes local merchants were allowed to bid for the products ahead of everybody else. I argue that the navigation laws, as well as the Carrera, basically were staples. In the case of the navigation laws, this is shockingly obvious. The most important act creating them was in fact called the Staple Act. In the case of the Spanish regulation, we have to go to the actual content of the rules. But sure enough, here we find quickly the single most important restriction imposed. That rule stipulated that goods had to be taken to particular ports either side of the Atlantic, a staple. What can we learn from this little exercise in looking inside the box of regulatory frameworks that structured colonial commerce and commercial exchange for centuries? The navigation laws were indeed drawn up with the explicit purpose to beat the Dutch. And yet, they drew on the same toolbox of regulatory measures that were familiar to merchants across Europe. These were rules that had been developed, tried, and tested by hundreds of urban corporations across Europe. Europeans used that toolbox, mixing and matching, combining and discarding, and slowly adapting it in the Atlantic. The outcomes were not identical, just as commercial regulations across European towns had not been identical. But the toolbox was common use. Transformations in the political constitution of early modern European polities and changes in how society conceptualized commerce barely affected what was inside the toolbox. But it did change which tools were taken out of the box and what consequences that entailed. And this is my last point for today. Both the English Parliament and the Spanish councils used medieval staple rights, the jus emporia, as a foundation for commercial colonial expansion. But the much more integrated realm of England applied the staple at a new territorial level, and to all those it said belonged to their territory. The staple was now all of England, and all the citizens of the realm could use it. In so doing, it created the first colonial exclusive, shutting out foreigners and keeping its own merchants from engaging across a new invisible line. Cooperation was still the name of the game, but it was skewed towards staying inside the British Empire. Spanish regulation remained true to its urban roots. That meant that anyone willing to ship to and from Seville, Havana, Veracruz, or Portobello was able to do so, and there was little reason to not cooperate across political boundaries. Returning to the story of the Asientos, it enabled Spanish elites or non-elites to continue to purchase Africans who had been enslaved and shipped by others. To conclude, I've tried to show that the story of European competition within leading to the first phase of globalization overstates the importance of interpolitic competition. Merchants must collaborate. There's no market without collaboration. The Spanish Empire became the place where the transatlantic slave trade first emerged, even though hardly any Spanish merchant was involved in the trade. They did not have to. Instead, well-known contracts used to make private investors supply goods or collect taxes, the Asientos, were offered to all that come. National historiographies have sometimes successfully painted over those collaborations. The story of the British Asiento is a case in point. The recourse to a known toolbox that could be used across the globe in shaping colonial traits made it easier to adapt. There's, of course, a side of the story I have barely mentioned. The tools in the box do not only structure the cooperation between Europeans, they also constructed colonial hegemony. Mixing and matching, choosing and discarding, and adapting was how Europeans imposed on the societies, hegemony on the societies of the Americas. Cooperation was much more important than competition. But that takes nothing away from the fact that the end result was European colonial hegemony. Globalization was there to stay. What we make of it is for us to decide. Thank you very much.